But I'm Kevin Krajcir. I'm the vice president of the Audubon Society of Central Arkansas, and I'm going to be presenting tonight on habitat associations and responses to prescribed fire of wintering Henslow sparrows in South Arkansas. And this is work I get to do through my position at the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission as a biologist and grants coordinator for the agency. So again, I just always like to start with a brief background of myself, so you can believe that I do bird work for a living. Most folks here know me, but I am a native Arkansan, and I've been a bird watcher since 2016 when I was at Hendrix College getting my bachelor's in both biology and Spanish. Afterwards, I went to Arkansas State University, where I did my master's in biology studying birds, and have been doing bird research in some capacity or another since 2014. After a brief stint of wanting to do a PhD and deciding to then leave that, I'm back in Arkansas since 2023 and have been working for the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission ever since, again, as a biologist and the grants coordinator for our agency. So get to have fun outside, but I also have to come back into the office and do some work sometimes too. So it's a lot of fun. All right, so getting into the topic for tonight, this is probably something that a lot of you are sadly very familiar with, the rapid decline of the birds that we love so much. Various threats are causing these losses in bird populations, and recent studies such as this, Rosenberg et al. Paper that took headlines back in 2019 report this alarming decline of birds, almost 3 billion breeding birds lost since 1970, and that's about 30% of the individual birds that we have in the United States and Canada. And that's mainly due to habitat loss and degradation, but they found, other factors like pollution, invasive species, etc., have been contributing to rapid bird declines. And, this is a trend across a lot of taxa, but definitely being noticed in our birds, which serve as really significant bioindicators of a lot of different habitats. So more specifically, when you break out, habitat guilds and those type of things, there have been extreme losses of grassland birds that are particularly concerning. This group is facing some of the steepest declines, with about 53% of grassland birds being lost in this same period of time since 1970. Startling, infographics like this to kind of really drive the point home show that, we've lost 3 in every 4 meadowlarks, eastern meadowlarks in that time, which is really devastating to think about. Within this grassland bird guild, we've also seen about 75% of grassland bird species being in decline. So of all the grassland bird species, 3 out of every 4 of them is experiencing decline in their population. The other, 25% are stable or if not increasing. But, that's a pretty sharp amount of birds of different species to be in decline. And again, for the majority of grassland species, it goes back to habitat loss. In the United States, we're losing about 2.5 million acres of grasslands each year. Some habitats have been lost, 99% of those grasslands have been lost. So it's really startling how rapidly this has been occurring, because it's just so easy to destroy a grassland to build houses or whatever it may be. And yeah, that comes at a cost of losing biodiversity such as birds. In Arkansas, we have a handful of different habitats that could be considered grasslands, including, different prairie types. But the one that we're going to focus on tonight for our Henslow sparrows is the saline soil barrens. And this is a particularly rare type of grassland habitat that only occurs in the Gulf Coastal Plain ecoregions of southern Arkansas, western Louisiana, and into eastern Texas. And I've shown in this picture what this habitat looks like. These barrens are formed were formed over geologic time when this area was underwater, when the ocean kind of covered the southern portion of Arkansas, and then that receded, leaving these areas of extreme salt concentration. So magnesium and sodium salts are really heavily concentrated in the soil, and that makes it, near impossible for a lot of tall or large plants, definitely woody vegetation, to grow successfully in these areas. So you get these wide open, grass dominated habitats with really unique soil chemistry. These barrens are also incredibly dynamic in that they're surrounded by this pine oak woodland usually. There's also pimple mounds or nebkas kind of in a matrix around a lot of these. There's often depressions in these barrens that hold a lot of water during this time of year, and in the spring they become vernal pools for amphibians to reproduce. So this is a really diverse, dynamic type of habitat, holds a lot of biodiversity. And the salts that I mentioned in the soils can be really concentrated in certain spots, and I'll show that on the next slide a little bit. And that forms what we call salt slicks. They're really, again, really concentrated area of these barrens. And again, just like a really extreme habitat that hosts a few plants that can only grow there. So yeah, you get, really awesome biodiversity in these types of habitats that have a lot of different structures and different soil chemistries and all that. As I mentioned, the biodiversity in these places are great, and that's because of the harsh soil conditions as well as the seasonal flooding. So under this layer of topsoil is a really thick clay pan of soil, which leads to poor drainage. And because of this, you get that seasonal flooding. Typically, historically at least, prescribed fires have not been needed to maintain these habitats because the soil, sodium, and the flooding conditions have maintained them as open. So you don't need prescribed fire as often to, tackle the woody vegetation that might creep in there. It just can't grow in there. But again, because these habitats are so unique and so harsh, you do get a really unique assemblage of plant and animals. Excuse me. I'm showing some of the cool plants here, and we'll actually begin doing surveys for some of these really soon. Geocarpon, and yes, that's my index finger right next to it, and that's a really big geocarpon. Geocarpon minimum is a federally threatened plant that grows in those extreme salt slicks or near them. Its global rank in terms of its conservation status is listed as a G2, which is imperiled globally. And then we also have Texas Sunnybell that grows in these barrens habitats here in Arkansas, listed as a G3, so a vulnerable species. But moving on to the star of the show tonight, the Henslow sparrow, which is a really handsome, small sparrow, spends its winters in Arkansas, in South Arkansas, in these habitats. And it is a short distance migratory grassland obligate sparrow. And you can see a picture of one here with their bright pink feet, olive green head, brick red back, and fine streaking on the breast. They're just a really stunning sparrow. I mentioned they're a short distance migrant. So they breed just north of Arkansas, mostly in the Midwest through the Great Lakes region, where they can breed in various grasslands, including some coastal marshes and thick weedy habitats. But in the winter, they often are found in grasslands and woodlands throughout the Southeast. So as you can see on the map in blue, southern Arkansas, all the way through eastern Texas, Louisiana, and further southeast to Florida. A lot of work on Henslow sparrows in the winter has been done further south and further southeast than Arkansas, looking at how they survive, what they eat, and all those things in longleaf pine savannas in the southeast. We don't have longleaf pine in Arkansas, so there hasn't been as much work to understand the sparrow's winter ecology in the habitats that it uses here in Arkansas in its winter. Overall, Henslow sparrows, just like a lot of grassland birds, are in decline. They have declined about 5% across their breeding range from 2012 to 2022. So that's pretty fast. There are increases in some areas, as you can see on this map to the right. This is based on eBird data. In the southwest portion of their range, it looks like there's actually some increases in them, but range-wide, there's generally been a decline. In Arkansas, we have this species ranked, as, again, a conservation status rank as SB1 SN2. The B stands for breeding season, the N stands for non-breeding, the S stands for state rank. So in its breeding season in Arkansas, it's listed as a critically imperiled species, and in its winter or non-breeding season here in Arkansas, it's a just imperiled. So overall, not great. But the last record of breeding of Henslow sparrows that was observed and reported on eBird, at least, was at Cherokee Prairie Natural Area in 2006. So it's entirely possible, 20 years ago at this point, entirely possible that, unfortunately, breeding populations of Henslow sparrows may be extirpated from Arkansas, no longer here. Might be further north at this point, and we don't have breeding Henslow sparrows in Arkansas. To be confirmed. We should probably be doing more surveys during the breeding season. I know a student who's working on this, and we'll see, but it doesn't look good, unfortunately, for breeding populations of this bird in our state. And again, this map is kind of showing relative abundance of this bird in different areas based on eBird in the winter. And you can see we have a good amount of data on birds in South Arkansas here. So I'll be talking about those birds here. I mentioned that there hasn't been a whole lot of work on wintering Henslow sparrows, especially in Arkansas and its habitats, but ANHC staff, Bill Holloman and Theo Witzel and some others, did work on this species in the winter of 2005-2006. They described habitat associations and densities of Henslow sparrows in the saline soil barrens, and eventually got that published as a paper that I'll be referring to as Holloman et al. In 2008. And this was one of the few studies, again, of winter ecology of Henslow sparrows in the barrens habitat. They found that sparrow density increased with the size or the area of the barrens that they were surveying in, as well as the recency of prescribed fire implemented in those areas. They also found that sparrows preferred sites with more bare ground, more aristida, which are three-on wire grasses, more rhynchospora or globe beak sedge cover, and more plant density at that 11 to 20 centimeters tall kind of height bin. But they didn't like moss or shrub cover in these areas. So kind of open, associated with these grass species, and kind of dense grass at a certain height. Since then, there haven't been any intensive surveys or studies of Henslow sparrows in these barrens in Arkansas. So that led to my project here. And it was to perform updated surveys of Henslow sparrows overwintering in the saline soil barrens throughout southern Arkansas. And I'll show you in a second which sites I considered for that. My objective also included to determine changes in their habitat preferences and responses to prescribed fire since Bill Holloman's study almost 20 years ago, and to assess potential threats and conservation strategies for this declining sparrow and the rare habitats that it lives in. So to do this, we had to go out and look for Henslow sparrows. And if you came on our ASCA field trip a couple weeks ago, or a couple months ago at this point, geez, it's been busy times. You got to see how we do that. Basically, you go out to these barrens habitats and you walk around and hope that you kick a sparrow up. Not actually kick, but that you flush one up through the grass. You walk close enough to it that it's going to jump up. And from experience, I can say that you have to be pretty close to them before they will jump up out of the grass. They will sit there and hope that you just keep walking by. Former coworker Emily Roberts here and I did a lot of these surveys, and sometimes we would stop. We were, maybe 5-10 feet from each other, we'd stop and say something to each other, and then a Henslow sparrow would pop up between us. And it only did that because we stopped to talk to each other and didn't keep walking. So they're very secretive. So you have to be in the appropriate habitat. You have to walk around, and you have to hope that you get close enough to one. And we did this. We walked transects, kind of snaking up and down through these grassy areas to cover the entire area. And we did this. This data set that I'm presenting tonight came from surveys conducted through mid-November 2023 through early February 2024. And we conducted these at 4 natural areas in South Arkansas, including Kingsland Prairie, Hall Creek Barrens, Warren Prairie, and Longview Saline Natural Area. And after we would flush up a sparrow, we marked the spot where the sparrow flushed from, and then we would usually chase it down to confirm that it was a Henslow sparrow, because every now and then, we would get Savannah sparrow, chipping sparrow, song sparrow. Although for most species, especially song sparrows, they would make a noise when you flush them. They'll give their little call note. And for Henslows, I always tell people, if you're walking and you flush it up and if it does make a noise, it's not a Henslow sparrow. They are super quiet. They prefer to run around on the ground. They're little mouse birds, and it's not often that you're going to hear them make a noise. Of course, I told a group that, and we were surveying for Henslow sparrows, and then the first sparrow we managed to flush gave the slightest little peep, and that's the one and only time I've heard a Henslow sparrow make a noise after flushing it. So very quiet little mouse birds here in the winter. So at each site, I mentioned we did transects, we walked through these barrens, and then I went in later using Google Earth imagery, aerial imagery, and estimated the size or the area in acres of each barrens. So you can see here, I kind of, drew in a polygon around that barrens. Because it's nice and open, you could see that on the aerial imagery, and it gave me an estimate in acres of how big that area was. And for each barrens, I then went into our habitat management database and looked at the last time that it was treated with prescribed fire to get that data as well. And I define that as the number of growing seasons since the last burn. And so, if it got burned in October and we surveyed it that December, that was 0 years or 0 growing seasons since last burn. But if it got burned the previous October, that was 1 growing season because it had the full summer to grow vegetation since that burn. So, we went out and we did this work. We surveyed for sparrows at all these sites, all the barrens that we could at these sites. Every time we found a sparrow, we marked the spot where it flushed from. And then we went back later to quantify the vegetation at that site where we flushed each bird. So I'm using the bird in the center here to represent, the point, the GPS point where we flushed the bird on our original survey. And from that point where we flushed the bird, we measured the closest distance to the nearest edge and the edge type. So the edge is just defined as the next habitat. We counted edge to be, pine plantations, oak pine woodlands, and then roads. So we used big, long measuring tape to measure the distance from where that sparrow was found to the nearest edge type, as well as the type of that edge. We also did a 1 meter plot, so using PVC pipe little frame. And within that 1 meter around that flush point, we looked at the percent cover of bare ground, thatch, so like thick clumps of grass or other vegetation, moss, lichen, herbaceous vegetation, and woody vegetation. Even though I mentioned, woody vegetation doesn't really grow well in the barrens, there are the occasional like short shrubs, pine saplings, and those types of things that do try to grow up in the barrens. So we did quantify woody vegetation when present. We also looked at the diversity of plants within this 1 meter grid. And so, we, as to the best of our ability, identified each plant either to species, genus, or family. And then we measured the percent cover of each type, each species of plant within that 1 meter grid. We also did a 5 meter radius circle around the central point where we looked at, in that circle, the percent cover of trees and shrubs, as well as the number of saplings and seedlings. So, short and tiny trees and shrubs. And then we quantified or noted the species of each that was present. Lastly, within the 5-meter circle, we walked, we did points in the 4 cardinal directions, so north, east, south, and west. And at each point was a meter apart, so 1 meter until we got to the 5-meter circle. At each point, we measured the depth of leaf litter, the height and species of the tallest herbaceous plant. A lot of the time it was little blue stem, really tall grass, and whether or not moss or lichen were present. So that was a simple yes, no, moss or lichen being present. These were the methods that Bill Holloman and everyone on the previous project used to measure vegetation. So we wanted to recreate their study to develop comparable results. So we did it as they did. And these are all the variables we measured when looking at vegetation, in the surrounding area of where the sparrow was found. So we conducted those vegetation surveys at 26 sites in the barrens across our survey sites where sparrows were found. So these are going to be referred to as our flushed points. So areas where we flushed sparrows, we had 26 of those. And then we also conducted 26 vegetation surveys at random points. So these are areas where we did not originally find a sparrow. They were just randomly generated using ArcGIS mapping technology. Just random points on the landscape within the barrens, not necessarily meaning anything. The point of using random points is they should just kind of be indicative of the general vegetation. And then we're going to compare those to the flushed points, which are hopefully areas that the sparrows have chosen specifically for whatever reason, for, a type of plant that they like to eat the seeds of, whatever it may be. And by comparing these, you can get at those habitat preferences and associations of the bird. So these are the vegetation surveys we did. And we did them starting in January of 2024 and finished in April. Just as things were starting to seriously green up. So we got those done. Data stuff in Program R, which is a statistics software. I went in and did various tests to compare differences in the distance to edge, which I talked about. Also looked at models and correlation tests for barren size and sparrow abundance, as well as some tests for prescribed fire. And then the main one I want to point out and we'll talk about is I compared differences in average dissimilarity in the plant communities and the ground cover of our random and our used or our flush points. So where we found the birds and then those random points that we surveyed. And so again, looking specifically at vegetation communities as well as ground cover types in those different, from those different vegetation surveys. And we did that by, again, looking at average dissimilarity through a method called analysis of similarity, or ANASIM. And to briefly explain how ANASIM works, it measures, as I said, the average dissimilarity of certain groups. Dissimilarity just being a way of how common things are within a group. So like looking at these candy jars, you can look at how similar or dissimilar they are based off the type of candy and the number of different candies in the jar. So, they may be similar in the fact that they all have 4 green candies, but then different in the fact that they lack the pink ones or have the multicolor ones. To give you an idea of this, you can describe things as completely similar. So the 2 candy jars towards the left, they are completely similar. They have the exact same number and types of candies. And so their dissimilarity is 0 because they are completely similar. There's no dissimilarity. Versus the candy jars on the right, there is no similarity, so they are completely dissimilar. So they have a dissimilarity score of 1. So that's basically what the ANASIM test tells us, is how different these things are based off of their dissimilarity. So again, 1 being completely dissimilar, 0. 1 being completely dissimilar, 0 being not dissimilar.
Okay.
So for our results, I found in our data set, in our recent surveys of Henslow sparrows, that their abundance was positively correlated with the size of the barrens. And we'll talk more about what that means here in a minute. But, that right off the bat, that should kind of make sense. Like, yeah, you find more birds in an area of bigger and more habitat. We also found a difference in their preference to the distance to the edge of the barrens. So, and that's comparing Bill's data, the Holloman et al. Study, to our current data set. So in the 2008 study, they found that the sparrows were about 29 meters from the edge on average. But in our study, we found that they were a lot closer to the nearest edge or the nearest other type of habitat, only 14 meters away. We also looked at prescribed fire and found that sparrow abundance was related to the number of growing seasons since last burn, but this was a marginal significance. And based off this is kind of like quadratic shape I have, where the arch over the data, you can see we found a lot of birds in 1 year since burn, fewer in 2, and even fewer in 3, and then no birds where it had just been burned. That makes sense. They want some vegetation to seek cover in. So if you've just burned the area, they're not going to hide in those areas because it's just wide open. All the vegetation has been burnt. But if you let it go too long, then it's too thick, and they like to run around on the ground. So they need some open area within that habitat. So I think, once you get past 2-3 years, it's way too thick, and they don't like those areas. So about 1.5 growing seasons since the last burn seemed to be where you could expect like maximum sparrow abundance based off of the data that we found. And then our vegetation survey. So these are those ANASIM results, so those dissimilarity results. And we found significant differences in the dissimilarity between our flushed or our used points, so where the sparrows were, and the random points where they were not, when we compared ground cover. So the dark circle that I've imposed here on the data, that is the random grouping. And then the light blue is our used or our flushed points. And you can see a significant amount of dissimilarity. Like the points pull separately, like away from each other. And that's what that's showing is, you kind of have a group over here. That's our used points. That's the ground cover that the sparrows liked. And then that's like the general ground cover everywhere else. We also found significant differences when applying this type of analysis to the Holloman data set, also for ground cover. I don't have their plot here, but that when you applied this analysis to that data set, you get the same thing. So that kind of helps confirm that ground cover is important and has been important for these sparrows over time. Breaking it down to the different types of ground cover, I've presented on the left the Holloman study, and you can see that those sparrows, they found that the sparrows preferred less bare ground, less thatch, more herbaceous vegetation, less moss, and more lichen. Versus our study, they seem to prefer more bare ground, more thatch, more herbaceous vegetation, less moss, and less lichen. And when you compare the data from ours to theirs, we found that there were significant differences in the amount of bare ground that they preferred. So, they liked more bare ground in our study, more thatch in ours, more herbaceous vegetation, and less lichen. There was no difference in the amount of moss that they seemed to prefer between the two studies. So that was the ground cover data, and now this is the vegetation community data. So looking at the diversity and abundance of the different plants, or the diversity and cover of different plant species in these plots. And this is where it gets kind of interesting. We did not find dissimilarity in the vegetation communities between our flushed used points, and our random points. So there were differences in ground cover, but the types of plants that made up the herbaceous cover, for instance, didn't really seem to matter. There were no differences. Again, if I kind of impose those circles over this to show you the different groups, you can see that they align over the top of each other a lot more than the previous graph did. But when you look at the Holloman studies data, and you apply this ANISIM analysis to their data, there were differences in the vegetation community and their average dissimilarities between the used and the random points that they surveyed. So there seemed to be, about 20 years ago, maybe some vegetation preferences of these sparrows, but now they don't seem to prefer certain types of vegetation as strongly, perhaps, at least based off the data that we collected. And we'll talk about what that might mean here in a little bit.
Yeah, curious.
So similarly to what Bill and his colleagues found in 2008, we found that sparrow abundances were positively associated with larger barrens and more recent burns. Again, more habitat, larger barrens, you're going to have more birds. And if it's burned more recently, not too recently, not 0 years, but like within the last few years, then you're going to get that good mix of vegetation as well as open habitat that these birds seem to prefer. Sparrows also preferred sites with more herbaceous vegetation and less moss in both studies. Vegetation probably provides them opportunities to hide, stay warm, and to forage for seeds and insects. And then the mossy sites are likely too wet for them. Moss obviously is an indicator of a site holding a lot of moisture, so perhaps those areas are too wet. And they run around on the ground. They're not going to be running through puddles or anything that may be nearby where some moss is growing. We did find things that were contrary to the Holloman study, though. As I mentioned, the sparrows seem to be moving closer to the barren's edge. One reason we think that this could be is due to habitat restoration at the natural areas, especially Warren Prairie natural area. So when Bill did the original study, the majority of the woodlands surrounding these barrens were still pine plantations, like really thick pine plantations, and just, not great for any kind of diversity. So it's like he described them as like walls around the barrens. So you wouldn't find any Henslow sparrows in there. Nowadays, though, we've done a lot of thinning, a lot of prescribed fire, and other things that have really opened up those woodlands to actually make them woodlands instead of pine plantations. And I found a handful of Henslow sparrows in those oak pine woodlands. So perhaps they're hanging out closer to the edge now because they can use that woodland habitat now that it's more open, and they're more willing to do so. So maybe they're running around in the barrens and then they go off into the pine plantations to hide if they need to. So I think that might be one reason why we're seeing them kind of closer to the edges. And by far and large, they did prefer pine woodland edges. We never really found them closest to the road or closest to a pine plantation. It was usually they were close to a pine woodland. So unlike Bill's study, we did not find any preferences for specific plant species. Again, vegetation communities at the flush sites and the random sites were not dissimilar. So again, not really showing any preference there for any specific type of plant. And we found different preferences in certain types of ground cover, so more thatch, bare ground, and less lichen. And based off this, it seems that vegetation structure and ground cover are what's most important to Henslow sparrows and their preferences for like their microhabitats during the winter. Perhaps they can eat a variety of plant seeds, so they're not as dependent on one type of plant. But they really need those areas where they have some cover as well as some bare ground to run around. And so they're really queuing in on those areas with specific ground cover. Anecdotally, and what's interesting in the story of Henslow sparrows over time is ANHC staff, so Bill, Theo, and others, as well as other conservation professionals and partners that we work with, have noticed that the barrens are changing. So those extreme salt slicks that I mentioned, they've noticed that those have shrunken over time, even over the past few decades, and that the barrens plant communities are shifting as well. They think that this is possibly due to climate change, both temperature related things, but mostly due to shifts in precipitation regimes and hydrology. As I mentioned, these sites really hold water. So, figuring out that piece of the puzzle as, droughts or extreme rain events or extreme flooding happen, like how does that change the plant communities and the soil chemistry at these sites? Because, if you're affecting the soil chemistry, that's obviously going to make its way up to affect what types of plants can grow in these spaces. So, haven't really quantified that exactly. And, our data don't look at any specific climatic effects here, but I think indirectly we found some things that kind of help support this. Again, the importance of large barrens and distinct microhabitats. So maintaining those diverse, large habitats, it's clearly important to these birds. And, trying to ward off against these changes to these habitats is really important. A recent or a clear dependence now on prescribed fire for these habitats. So as I mentioned, historically, you didn't have to burn the barrens as much as we do nowadays because the soil chemistry was really good at excluding dense herbaceous and woody vegetation. But now, possibly due to these changes in hydrology and precipitation, soil chemistry, climate, because of all that, we need to implement prescribed fire a lot more regularly. And we try to do so at Warren Prairie and these similar sites, these pine flatwoods and barren sites every 2 to 3 years, just to help maintain the health of those habitats. And again, that didn't need to be done as often back in the day, or it just wasn't as those sites were newly acquired. But nowadays, it seems really critical to maintaining those habitats and their structure. So we're trying to really stick to a good prescribed fire regime to help maintain those habitats as open and healthy for this biodiversity. Also, the fact that we found no differences in the used and random points vegetation, I think is kind of a hint at the potential homogenization of the vegetation in the barrens. So, especially, those harshest environments beginning to shrink. If all your random points are starting to look very similar to where the birds are wanting to be, maybe you're not having as many of those, niche places for them to be. So that could be, again, it's a bit of a stretch, but it could be an indirect indicator of some of these changes that anecdotally have been mentioned over time. Need to do more studies, of course, into exactly, what the mechanism is, accounting for some climatic variables and that. But yeah, it's really interesting to think about. So what does this mean for conservation of this species? Clearly, this bird is a habitat specialist. It's a grassland specialist. And for habitat specialists, it's really important that you maintain high quality, rare habitats that they use, because it's critical to conserving those species. These birds overwinter in Arkansas, and they use this rare habitat. So the habitat restoration and management that we do is really going to be critical in supporting them through the winters. As I mentioned, prescribed fire is going to be an important tool as we continue to maintain the habitat for these birds and other biodiversity in the area. But just doing these surveys, I really noticed the impacts of non-native species, especially on these habitats. But then, as I just mentioned, that has a direct impact then on the species that use these habitats. And the specific invasive species that I'd like to point out are feral hogs. They, might be part of the story of the soil chemistry and the changes of these sites. because I've gone out to some of these barrens and seen them just be completely tore up by hogs rooting and digging up and wallowing and all the things. They contribute to erosion. They might be bringing in invasive plant species that they consume, through their feces or on their fur. So they're really bad down there at these sites. Here's an example of some hog damage. I'm pretty sure this is at Warren Prairie. You can see in like the top of this photo, you can see my cursor, the top here, that's kind of what, nice intact grassland, grassy barrens should look like. And then here in the center and lower portion of the photo, you can see where the hogs have kind of rooted and dug up areas to eat roots or whatever they're doing. That's one example, and that's honestly a pretty light example. You get areas like this too, where they just wallow in this whole thing and tear it up. And it should look like all this in the background, but I've seen over the past few years, I've seen it get a lot worse. And certain areas, like I said, have just been completely torn up, and it's really, really a problem. And we're working on ways to mitigate the effects of feral hogs, because they're a tricky problem. They're a smart animal, and need to figure out a way to keep them from destroying these habitats. So moving forward, I'm still working on hopefully publishing this study, finalizing some of our analysis and writing. Hopefully by the end of the year, I'll be able to do that and have, a more fleshed out story of these comparisons. I just kind of summarized a few of the main analyses here for y'all tonight. Also interested, maybe not here, maybe in other studies, or maybe in a longer data set of incorporating prescribed fire intensity and coverage data into this. So usually after the prescribed fire is done, they go out and do a post-burn evaluation where they measure the intensity of the fire, as well as, the area that was covered by the fire. So looking at those things to see if that really, if a certain level of fire intensity or coverage really seems more beneficial or not to these birds and their habitats. And then a project I'm working on right now, because I love to start a new project. Finishing a project's hard, but starting a new project is fun. I am with lots of volunteers, some folks who are here tonight, have been going out and capturing Henslow sparrows and banding them with color bands so we can do future resites of these birds more easily. But I've also been collecting fecal samples from them to look at their diet. So basically, the DNA fragments of the bug or the seeds or whatever that they ate are within the fecal sample. And then you can send those to the lab for DNA metabarcoding, which is really fancy lab work to amplify and look at those DNA fragments. And we're interested to see what they're eating in this very unique habitat, because we might learn, they really depend on the seeds of this plant species. Maybe they really specialize in eating those seeds of that plant. Well, then we need to do a good job of conserving that plant for this bird too. So something as simple as what are they eating in the winter here in Arkansas is still unknown to us. So I think it's a pretty easy, it's a pretty low-hanging fruit for something we can work to figure out to potentially benefit the conservation of this species. So working on that. I need to hopefully go out soon, hope maybe tomorrow, and catch a few more birds while they're still here for the winter. So been working on that this year a lot. Otherwise, I'll just acknowledge ANHC's botanist, Ben Benton. He helped me a ton with the plant or the vegetation surveys. Of course, Bill Holloman, who was our former director and gave me a lot of guidance and really got me interested in Henslow sparrows and their ecology, and kind of guided the revamp of this project. And of course, laid the groundwork with his original study. And a lot of ANHC staff and volunteers who have assisted with sparrow surveys and fieldwork over the past few years. It's been really special to get to work with this species and get to take people out to see it and eventually get to be banding and capturing them. It's been a lot of fun. So with that, I can take any questions, and I'll go ahead and stop sharing. so I can see everybody.
Kevin, how does one take a fecal sample from a bird that small?
Yes, so for any of your like small songbirds, because of this method, what we're interested in getting out of the poop, you want to make sure that you're not getting contamination of the DNA. So you have to use clean bags. Basically, we'll catch the bird in the mist net. I'll get it out, and then I put it in a brown paper lunch bag. It's breathable, and we leave it in there for 10, 15 minutes. Usually, you can see if they've done their business in the bag. It's like a little wet spot. Um, and then I'll pull them out, do all the measurements, do the banding, and then take a clean pair of tweezers and um, pull out the pieces of the fecal sample from what's left in the bag. And we make sure to collect just the feces and not the white urea, the nitrogenous waste, because that can affect the DNA quality. So I just leave them in a bag for 15 minutes. They're pretty constantly pooping, so it's pretty easy to get a fecal sample from them if you just give them a little time.
So no anal probes of the birds.
Nope, we don't do that.
Oh dear. Um,
I see in the chat, Sarah asked how many more birds I want to capture for this current study. I had a very lofty goal when I was none the wiser of how hard it would be to catch them and how much time I would have this winter of capturing 30 birds. Unfortunately, so far I've only captured five. So I think I want to aim for a sample size of 10 this year. So hopefully five more within the next month, because about mid March is when they'll start to migrate. You can get them through the end of March, but five more this year. And then I'm going to speak with collaborators and see if 10 is enough. And if it's not, then hopefully another 10 or so next year. And we'll see how that goes. So if you're ever down at Warren Prairie or other sites and you see a Henslow sparrow, be sure to check the legs and see if there's any color bands on it, because I've been putting color bands on them in unique combinations too, so we can try to recite them as they um, return and all that.
Kevin, another question I had. So when you went
Yeah.
back to do the vegetation surveys
Mm-hmm.
around the area where you flushed the bird, did you reflush the bird in that 5 meter circle?
I think very rarely we might have,
Ah,
or we would be like walking to one and then boop, Henslow sparrow, and I'm like, I bet it's you. We're walking back to your spot.
ah,
What was really funny is we were walking to our first, might have been our first ever random point. So, just a random spot on the landscape. And we flushed a Henslow sparrow at that spot. And I was like, well, can I count this as random if a Henslow sparrow is using it? So I think we did the survey anyway, because, the point of random is like not necessarily that it's bad for the birds, so they're not going to be there. It's just, this is just a random point on the landscape. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. Versus the flushed areas, it's like, we know there are birds here. There's something here that has obviously drawn them here. So, yeah.
hmm.
Here was another question. Oh, yeah, that's cool. Northeast Louisiana. Yeah. If anyone ever wants to come sparrow stomping with me, just let me know. Happy to have you. It does take a team, especially trying to catch them, because um, like I said, we usually have to spread out and walk them towards a mist net that we've set up in the field. Um, Even just doing the surveys, I never usually go alone because it's so much more ground to cover just one person walking back and forth. It's nice to have a team to spread out and look around for them, because, like I said, you might walk right past them and they will just run on the ground and run away from you. So having more people and talking and spreading out really helps your chances of getting them. So that's why when we did the ASCA field trip a couple months ago, there were like 25 of us and we all spread out into a big line and we flushed up 3 or 4 Henslow sparrows. So it was good to have that much coverage that day. Um, so that's the thing with these barrens is Sarah's question was, are there other species you typically see or capture near them? In the barrens, I feel like I'm gonna most commonly see or flush up a Henslow sparrow. There's not many per barrens, but if it's just one bird here or there, unless it's a really wet, thick spot, it's probably a Henslow sparrow. The wetter, thicker spots, you'll probably get swamp or song sparrows too. I see those a lot. Sometimes you'll be walking through the barrens and you'll flush up a woodcock or a bobwhite. Those are really fun and scary too because they'll just like explode out of the grass. Um, but you'll also occasionally flush up big groups of savanna sparrows or and juncos or chipping sparrows too. Sometimes I flushed up groups of 30 or 40 of those birds. And you go, oh yeah, that's not a Henslow sparrow. There's 30 of them all at once. Every now and then I'll flush maybe two Henslow sparrows pretty close to each other, but they're never in big flocks like that. They're usually pretty solitary. So
Interesting.
yeah, you don't go down there for necessarily tons and tons of birds, like tons of individuals. You go down there for the rare stuff. The Henslow sparrows at Warren Prairie, we have populations of red cockaded woodpeckers. So things like that, you go for the cool stuff. I usually just release anything else we catch. We've never caught anything else. Just Henslow sparrows, because after the first time you flush them, you really got to chase them down to keep them moving towards the net. So I would probably just release. Also, when I go out, I just bring the equipment I need for Henslow sparrow. So I don't have all the band sizes with me. I just have the two sizes that Henslows can take. And yeah, mainly just interested in them on those days. But you've heard about our other banding project at the Little Rock Audubon Center. That we just band everything we catch because we're interested in the survival of all the birds at that site. But for this one, I'm just looking at Henslow sparrow specifically. So.
Okay.
Have I recaptured any banded ones? Yes. The I tried originally capturing them in 2024 and I banded a couple just to see like proof of concept, like can I catch these birds? And I recaptured one that already had a band on it that Spencer Witzel with the Fish and Wildlife Service had banded down there. So that was cool. And he had banded it that winter. And it was neat to, be like, wow, this one already has a band on it. Cool. And then this past winter, I think must have been in January. We were at Warren Prairie and I was walking through a barrens trying to flush up a sparrow and we got it there. And it also had a band on it already. And based on the sequence, it's also a bird that Spencer, I'm assuming, banded down there. So I need to reach out to him and be like, hey, also when I turn in the banding data to the bird banding lab, they'll let me know that this was not my bird. But I'm going to reach out to him. I've been meaning to and be like, hey, I think I caught one of your birds again. When did you band it? Because it has the potential that he banded it, 2 winters ago, perhaps. I think it was only one number off from the bird that I saw the previous time. So unless he took a break in banding or whatever. So I need to follow up with him and see about that bird. But yeah, which has also been really surprising to me because I've read that Henslow sparrows have really strong within season site fidelity. So like they have a really tight home range for that winter. And then the next winter, they don't come back to the same spot. Whether that be because they didn't survive the year or whatever. At least the studies that I've read, it seems like they don't tend to come back to the exact same spot. Like we think of a lot of breeding birds as they come back to that same spot year after year if it was successful breeding. Winter's obviously different. The goal is to survive, not necessarily to obviously have babies in that successful spot. But yeah, I think they will probably choose different spots each from year to year. So it'll be interesting to see where he originally banded that bird and when. Because if he banded it in that spot and it was a couple years ago, that'll be really neat to know. But this is the first year I've deployed a lot of bands and definitely deployed color bands. So I'll be interested to go out next year and start seeing if any of the color banded birds have come back. So we'll see. Stay tuned.